The Badlands Miniset has been out for 5 days, and I believe I know the best decks that you can grind to Legend or grind in Legend. Before the Miniset was introduced, I was able to stay in double-digit Legend throughout the entirety of this season, with only a couple times dipping down to triple-digit Legend. And I am very happy to note that I have fallen out of that. I have actually taken a bit of a hit yesterday because there are a lot of different things that are evolving in this meta, and I was a bit wrong with my predictions about Druid being absolutely busted to the point where it needs emergency nerfs. There are ways of beating Druid, but one thing that's very unfortunate is that Rogue is back on top of the meta, and we have a lot of different decks that we're checking out. So if you like Hearthstone decks, if you like knowing how to conquer the meta, go ahead and like this video and, subscribe to the channel so that way you know how to best grind within Legend, because things change very quickly within Hearthstone, but some things remain the same, and this deck is a great example on how some things just stay the same because they are very powerful. If you guys are not aware of this, Warlock is confirmed to be nerfed in the future patch. We don't know when this patch is yet. If you want my honest opinion, it's probably going to be in the next week, not this week, but the week after. And then, yeah, Warlock will be nerfed, and we can see how good this deck can rely without that constant scam. But if you guys haven't played this deck, and if you want to give it a shot before it gets nerfed, the cards that you want to keep in the mulligan are Scourge Illusionist, Warlock, as well as Shatter Shambler. If you have your Warlock, you keep a card in order to help transform him, because this card is now fixed. If you play one class card, it does transform into a 3/6 with charge that discovers a card and discounts it by 3, and this ability is insane with Shadow Step and insane with Breakdance. So yeah, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about how to play this specific deck. If you guys want to learn how to play any of these decks that I already have videos on, go ahead and check out the YouTube channel. And there's going to be a lot of videos that are be coming in the future if I haven't actually talked about them yet. Just like the next deck that we're going to start talking about, which has completely taken the meta by storm. Sludge Warlock is actually a good deck at top Legend. However, there are a few different lists that are running around, and I have decided to showcase 2 of the decks that I have been playing. And honestly, I started off very well with this build right here from Donkey over at donkey.top. So if you want to get the best deck lists in the game from the streamers that you watch, Donkey is the best way of being able to get those deck lists. But regardless, Donkey actually managed to hit rank 9 Legend with this particular version of Zoolock that happens to run Gloomstone Guardian as well as Forge of Wills. So that way you have a turn 3 Forge of Wills into a consistent turn 4 6/8 times 2 or 2 7/7. So this deck actually feels like a combination between old Zoolock and old Handlock, where you can easily pressure the game with in the early turns with cards like Flame Imp, but then you have, these big turns, these big swings that can help you deal with bigger threats. However, one thing about this deck that is very important to note is that Chaos Creation, I'm just going to say that I predicted this card being amazing. I made the claim that Sludge Warlock was going to be a competitive deck, and it's mostly due to Chaos Creation giving it so much game to the point where this card can literally be a 6-mana deal 3 if you have both of your disposal assistants as well as your sludge on wheels ready to go when you need them. You don't even need both of your sludge on wheels, but both disposal assistants is very important for this, because you can pretty much get 4 sludges at the bottom of your deck if they end up dying before turn 6. So now your sludge only needs to get hit twice in order to put 6 at the bottom of the deck, and if your opponent has absolutely nothing on the field when you play this, that is literally just deal 30 for 6 mana. 6 plus 24, because there are 6 4 damage sludges at the bottom of the deck. So the way that you counter this deck is by going wide onto the field, which is why you need plenty of ways of being able to remove anything that your opponent plays. So that's why we have the Fatigue package in order to make a Popgar into Crescendo turn another possibility at removing the board, because if you can make it to turn 10, or actually, if you make it a turn 8, you can play Popgar into Crescendo into Chaos Creation, so that way you can guarantee that the sludges that are at the bottom of your deck can hopefully go to the face if your opponent does go wide on the board. But this deck actually has a surprising amount of ways of being played, to the point where Gloomstone Guardian isn't even a card that you need to forge all too often. There are some situations where discarding 2 cards really works, because you either have sludges in your hand or you have furnace fuels that you want to throw away. So the card actually feels a lot better than I was originally giving it credit for, because there are some situations where you don't care about the forge and you don't care about a mana crystal. You can just play this right after you play your Forge of Wills without any real drawback, because it really doesn't matter if you destroy a mana crystal. I don't think, this deck really cares too much about that because of the low curve. But if you don't want to play this version of Sludge Lock, if you don't want to play the big minion, then you can just play more small minions and you can run cards like the Geode, for example. This is a great card, and particularly this deck, because you want to have as much card draw as possible. And you don't want to spend too many turns actually hitting the hero power, from my experience, because you just want to play for tempo. You want to be on the field, and you want to make sure that you have that damage early on, because as soon as Druid plays that gain 20 for 3 mana, draw a card, oh my god, it's just really difficult to kill them, so you really want to make sure that you have the biggest board as quickly as possible. But regardless, if you don't want to be playing Sludge Warlock and instead you want to be playing the class that cheats a lot of armor, these are going to be the Druid decks that are going to be the most impactful in the meta. We truly are in a cursed timeline because Mill Druid is on top of the meta, and whenever a card like Due Process is actually one of the best cards in the game, it is a very concerning thing. I just made a video talking about this previously. I think it was yesterday that I ended up posting it, but regardless, Due Process is actually a very good card because Druids are completely unkillable. They just don't die because Pendant of Earth is always going to find your Naga Giant, so that way you're always gaining 20 armor for 3 mana, which is just Ferocious Howl, but on crack in all honesty, because it does kind of make sense. If I can pull this up real quick, it does kind of make sense how Druid could have like a 3 mana draw a card. And Ferocious Howl is like the only card that I could think of that is even somewhat close to the ability of the Pendant. But the difference between Ferocious Howl and the other card is that you needed 9 cards in order for this to gain, in order to gain 10 armor, which really wasn't that difficult back in the day. But Pendant is just a really consistent card because you get to discover minions in your deck. And even though there is a possibility of discovering like Finley and Audio Amplifier, most of your cards are above 7 mana anyway. So you are usually going to gain anywhere between 7 to 20 armor with this card. So Pendant is absolutely busted, and the reason why this deck is really good is because it utilizes the extra cards from Renathal, so that way the Due Process will not overdraw you. It will mostly overdraw decks that aren't Renathal. And even if you do have to worry about potential Renathal decks, this deck actually has a lot of game because you have Sir Finley Sea Guide as well as Shadow Reflection combos as a possibility in order to keep shuffling your hand into your deck, so that way you hopefully never take fatigue. This deck is very simple in concept, but when you start getting into the late stages of the game, where if you go up against the right opponent that knows how to play their Finley, they can just essentially Uno reverse card the game for you to where you might put yourself in an accidental unwinnable position because you didn't think about a certain card like Finley, for example. So don't draw too much with this deck. Try to play Solar Eclipses with your Due Processes, but I would actually recommend for you not to play double Solar Eclipse into Due Process. I would argue that one of your Solar Eclipses should try to go on one of your armor cards, so that way you maximize how much survivability you have, so you can keep taking fatigue, keep taking damage, and essentially being one big tank hero that literally never dies. It is impossible to kill Druids in the right situations. So if you want to be playing one of the best decks in the game right now that also has the most amount of decisions in a lot of situations, I would actually recommend Mill Druid because it can feel like a very fun deck to figure out the puzzle for, but being on the receiving end of this deck is absolutely not what needs to happen. So I'm going to use this opportunity to predict 2 nerfs that'll happen to this deck. Pendant of Earth, I feel like, is just for sure going to be nerfed to where this card might actually just be draw a minion, gain armor equal to its cost, instead of discover a minion in your deck, because, I mean, it's just the easiest way to make sure this card doesn't become just 3 mana, gain 20 every single time. And it is very worth noting that Naga Giant is rotating out, so maybe we don't even need to go this far with Pendant of Earth, but if you were to change it, that's probably how it needs to be changed. However, Shattered Reflections might be a card that has to be nerfed because if this ANR combo is going to be this much of a powerhouse in Druid, then this combo might need to be hit because every single Druid deck and top Legends is running this sort of combo, and there's a couple of different decks running around where it's not just Fatigue, it sometimes is Ignis, some people are running Thaddeus combos. Like, Druid has everything that it could ask for right now, and it's really just about picking a win condition that you enjoy, to where Shattered Reflections might need to become choose a non-Titan minion, so that way it doesn't just become ANR support. But regardless, there's another Druid deck that I would actually highly recommend if you're trying to get some free wins. But there is another version of this deck that I want to showcase, even though I don't believe it's nearly as good. It's essentially the exact same thing, except we are running a more consistent ramp with Take to the Skies and Splish Splash Whelp. I don't know which one of these decks is better. I think the stats are probably going to say that the first deck is going to be the one that you want to play if you want to have the best consistent win rate, because this deck actually sacrifices cards like Reno to make room for the dragons. So this deck really can't be changed all too much. I'm really not sure what card to cut out of this deck in order to make Reno work. I was actually thinking about maybe cutting a Cactus Construct, because I really think Reno should be in a deck like this, and I believe I got this specific list from J. Alex. He's been playing a lot of Druid in his spare time. I don't really know why. I think his chat's just making him do it. But regardless, this is a pretty easy deck that you can get some wins with, very similar with Mill Druid. It's just you are making that consistent approach of trying to get your Topior as frequently as possible. So if you want to play this version of the deck and focus more on the dragons that you can generate, this is one way of doing it. But I do believe that the other mill deck that I just showed you is probably going to be the best deck that you can play if you want to abuse Druid mechanics. Next up, we have Aggro Demon Hunter, and there's not really much to talk about with this deck, except for the fact that apparently Burning Heart does not make its way into this deck, and I can kind of understand it, because the spells that you want in this deck are going to be 0 mana. Even though this can potentially deal 2 damage to the field and then give you an additional 3 attack, it's probably not going to be that consistent. But one new card that definitely makes the cut in this deck is going to be the Quick Pick. After your hero attacks, draw a card. The way that I like to describe this card is that you're essentially just becoming a gold panner yourself. Like, it's got the 2 mana 1/2 stat line, and you get to attack twice, and then the pick goes away. And most times, this card is usually only going to draw you 1 or 2 cards. So Quick Pick is just a better way of being able to have that consistency. And it's a great card to keep in the mulligan, so that way you can play Quick Pick on 2 into Sigil of Time on 3. And if you have the coin, then you can potentially just start shooting by turn 4. So that is a lot of consistency. However, there was a player that happened to put ETC Band Manager in Aggro Demon Hunter. This deck just goes through all kinds of weird optimizations as we continue through this competitive Hearthstone expansion. But regardless, Sir Finley Sea Guide, Weight of the World, and Argus are the cards in this deck, and I believe I could explain every single one of these decisions. So Finley is in here, so that way if you have your ETC Band Manager and a bunch of cards, but you don't have Sharpshooter, you could just play the Finley in order to get the Sharpshooter a bit more consistency, and a little bit more consistently. Argus is there in order to potentially discount your minions if you need to go for a double Sharpshooter turn for a bunch of damage. So that could be a good way of maybe pressuring a bit of the Druids that you will see with all the armor gain that they have. And then there's Weight of the World, which I'm assuming is where you have a pretty decent hand, but you just need to draw a few more cards in order to make it worth it. I find it very funny that this card's in the deck without Ignis actually being there. But regardless, that would explain the ETC, and I don't know how good it actually is, but it sounds pretty decent. But I would say if you don't have these legendaries, then don't bend over backwards to craft them. They're not going to be like the end-all be-all. If you want to get rid of the ETC, you can very easily just put Finley into the deck, and that's a great way of being able to substitute for it. But if you don't have Finley, then you might be fine with just adding 1 copy of Burning Heart, because this might be a good way of being able to bring back a board against, like, say, Divine Shield taunt minions, which you will see a lot, and I wonder what deck we're going to be talking about next that has a lot of Divine Shield taunt minions. But Aggro Demon Hunter seems to be a good way of trying to punish the Druids if they don't have their armor gain early on in the game, but you still have a lot of potential with Naga Demon Hunter, to the point where there's actually Big Demon Hunter that is coming back with a Naga package. This deck is finding some game yet again, and I believe the main reason why is because of the consistency of Quick Pick of being able to draw you some extra cards. So I guess if you want to play an interesting Demon Hunter, this is about as interesting as it gets, which is very sad in my opinion, because there's just not a lot of room for Demon Hunter experimentation to actually be fruitful. But regardless, if you want to play the most interesting Demon Hunter deck, Big Demons and Nagas might be the way to go to make use of some of these new cards from the mini set. Next up are going to be some of the easiest decks that you can play in Legend if you just care about playing something that essentially wins games and doesn't really care about how you win the game, because Paladin is by far one of the most frustrating things that keeps getting nerfed, keeps becoming popular, keeps getting nerfed, keeps becoming the best deck in the game. And we're probably going to have to nerf this deck again, because Excavate is literally a card that is being utilized in a way to where you just play it for Wind Fury in some decks. There are some Paladin decks that do try to go for the Excavate treasure, but I would argue that the best way of playing Paladin right now is just playing regular pure Paladin with a bunch of minion procs, a bunch of minion generation, and then you have the double Garden's Grace into Shroomscavate on a 1/1 dealing 22 damage. So all you really need to do with this deck is deal like 9 damage to the opponent, so that way you have enough damage to actually kill with the Wind Fury combo. And the thing about this deck, even if you leave up a 1/1, like I just said with the Guard's Grace combo, but you also have Deputization Aura in order to potentially turn this into OTK levels of damage. So I think that going all in on the pure strategy is a very lame way about winning with this particular deck, but it is still a powerhouse deck, needless to say. And mining casualties, not only at Death Knight, but in Paladin, is a very good tool in order to help you just stick minions onto the field. So that way you can have that amazing stat bomb that you can just throw all at once. It's kind of crazy in my opinion, and I don't think that Paladin should have Wind Fury, but as long as it does, people are going to be utilizing it. But if you want to go all in on actually making the Excavate package work, Funky Monkey's Mining Paladin is actually the most popular deck on HS Replay. It actually has a 60% overall because it just makes sense that this kind of deck would be good because you just stick minions and then you have a potential way of buffing up all of your minions thanks to the new Excavate treasure, the Azranite Dragon, giving all of your minions in your deck hand as well as the battlefield +3/+3. So all those recruits that you add to your hand, they are now going to be 4/4s. It is a lot easier to stick a minion to the point where the Wind Fury will be another great way of being able to close out the game. But if you actually want to utilize the Excavate cards and the way that Blizzard hopefully intended it, then this might be the way of going about it. And it actually runs a little bit more mid-game, so games become a little bit more interesting. That isn't just, you know, play the Crusader Aura and just win by turn 4. So I would say that Paladin does have some cool things going for it, but you gotta be able to sacrifice the consistency of pure Paladin being the best deck of the game, and you gotta put some neutral cards in here like Funky Monkey did in order to have a fun way of playing Paladin that isn't just going full Unga Bunga. So I would actually highly recommend this deck because not only is it a way of utilizing some of the new cards, it is one of the most popular decks that you could be playing right now with one of the best win rates. And next up, we have Plague DK. It really didn't get all too much from the expansion. However, Mining Casualties does give this deck a much easier way of being able to make the Rezka cost cheaper, faster, because this card is literally just 4 minions in 1 card. And honestly, I have one other deck that I'm going to be showing you guys to where Mining Casualties is actually the reason why the deck is going to be better than you would give it credit. And it's a way of being able to bully Druid, because if you have the Hell Yeah play, then they have to do some kind of weird shenanigans in order to, you know, not take the plague damage by either keeping a full hand of cards or somehow playing Finley in order to reduce the amount of curses that are actually in the deck. But I believe that Plague DK has never felt better to play on the ladder if you're trying to legitimately counter some of these archetypes that you'll run into. I would say that Paladins are probably going to be the hardest matchup for you to beat, so that's why having more early game as well as having the hardcore cultist seems very important. You could easily sub out a card like Sylvanas for a second hardcore cultist if you don't believe this card is good enough to run at your current MMR because you're just not seeing good Sylvanas targets. So if you want to deal with more of the aggressive decks, then go ahead and put in another hardcore cultist. But this deck is relatively unchanged, but is still extremely powerful. Even though it really didn't get that much from the mini set, this card is still good enough in order to make those synergies happen and keep yourself alive in the mid game, so that way your late game comeback with like lifesteal rush minions is very effective against decks that don't like to see extra life gain. And I've got some bad news for people that wanted Reno Warrior to be good, because we are now going into the fun meme decks of the expansion. That's right, Reno Warrior is a meme, and you guys owe me an apology because I, from the very beginning, said that Bran is a 6-mana 2/4, do nothing. And that's exactly what this card is. Like, the only real way to win with this deck is to play Astalor and to have Astalor double up its battle cry for, you know, 2 5-mana Astalors and then eventually 4 8-mana Astalors if you have enough time to get there. But I'm going to say that Reno Warrior is just a worse control warrior, and I do have a video planned talking about this deck in particular, because every single time I queue up this deck, I can't win with it. But the thing that drives me crazy is that every single time I queue into it, it beats me. So what exactly is going on here? Am I just a bad player that doesn't know how to stop this deck from beating me? Or am I just getting high rolled? The answer is simple. I'm just getting high rolled. Because the reason why this deck is actually somewhat consistent is because a lot of people were running Talon Forge Ring in order to get the brand as quickly as possible. However, this version of the deck is not even like not able to do that because we actually run cards like Boom Boss as well as Badlands Bouncer. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. This deck is just a worse control warrior that sometimes can high roll with Brand, but you're mostly playing a lot of unoptimal cards like Gaslight Gatekeeper. And the reason why this card is in the deck is because you do have the Boom Boss as a possibility of high rolling your opponent, to where if you play Brand, you play Boom Boss, you can then shuffle 6 TNTs into the deck. Then you can play Gaslight Gatekeeper in order to find those TNTs in order to get the value from them immediately. But unfortunately, there is just way too much inconsistency with this deck. Too many bad cards that you have to run because you don't get to run duplicates. And the other thing that really sucks about this deck is the fact that you can't play Kobold Miner and you can't play your Burrow Buster, which Burrow Buster doesn't even find its way into this list. Like, this isn't even a good list. I'm gonna have to find another list because I can't even... There's just so many bad lists when it comes to Reno Warrior. People are trying so hard to cope themselves into saying this deck was good, but it is just simply not there. And unlike the other decks that I showed you guys, I'm actually going to show you the tier list placing of this deck, not only in top legend, but in regular legend. So here we are, we have top legend stats in the past 3 days, so that way we are only excluding games from the mini set. And if you take a look down, Highlander Warrior is at the bottom. It's at the bottom. Look at that. All you Reno Warrior players that said that this deck was insane, you owe me an apology because this deck is not good in top legend, even though this is the most popular deck that has been played in the past 5 days. So there's a lot of data that is surrounding this. And if we take a look at legend, where is Reno Warrior? Where is Reno Warrior? It is barely staying alive at tier 3 with like a 1% difference, to where if it had 1% less, it would just be another tier 4 deck. So unfortunately, I do not think I could recommend playing Reno Warrior. But if you're going to play a good deck list, this next list coming up, I believe, is probably going to be the best way of making a bad deck viable. If you are someone that really wants to play Reno Warrior, this would be the deck that I would recommend, even though there still might be some cards that I personally am just not a fan of, but for some reason, this seems to be one of the best win rate decks in the legend ranks, particularly with Reno Warrior, that I saw in HS Replay, but I still just don't believe in this deck, to where I am going to tell you guys that if you want to actually win games of Hearthstone, do not play Reno Warrior. Only play this deck if you, for some reason, really just like the card Deep Miner Brand, and if you're really just want to utilize your Diamond Brand. Otherwise, I would stay as far away from this deck as possible because we don't even know what the optimal build is, and there's just so many awkward cards in here. Like Disposal Bot, for example. There's no way this card is that good in this deck. Zola, I also have a little bit of questions about, but I'm assuming that all these cards are put into the deck with the hindsight thinking, ooh, wait a minute, if I play Brand on 6, then this deck is absolutely cracked. But what about every other situation to where you don't draw Brand? You're just playing a worse arena deck at this point. So yeah, I just really can't recommend this deck. And I just don't want to see you guys play Reno Warrior and then have your dreams get crushed when you find out that it legitimately is just an Astalor scam deck. That's really all this deck is, to where if you can consistently get your Brand by 6 and then play your Astalors by turn 9, then you have the actual win condition of Astalor just winning the game. And that's a very lame way of winning, in my opinion. It is a way of winning with this deck, and if you get W's with it, I give you respect, but I will say that this deck is just functionally boring in my opinion. And another reason why I think it's bad is because, as I was saying with the Burrow Busters, you can't play your Excavate cards until after you play the Brand, because God forbid you play a Kobold Miner before you play your Brand, then play your Burrow Buster, and now you're sitting at 3 Excavates, and you're waiting for that last Excavate card in the deck, which I believe is a spell, the Blast Charge, and that is literally the only Excavate cards in this deck. So there's just a lot of inconsistency, and now I'm starting to understand why Zola might be a little bit better, because being able to Zola the Ox, for example, could be a very good powerhouse play. But all of these good turns happen like post turn 7, post turn 8, to where I cannot recommend this deck enough. I don't know how many times I've said this deck is bad, but trust me, guys, I'm not just being a hater. I couldn't win with this deck, and the only time I really lost to this deck is when they just had everything lined up perfectly. So do not fall for the bait. If you want to play Highlander Warrior to be fun, this would be the deck that I'd recommend, but I would say to not expect to win a lot of games because this deck is just not good. Next up, we have Fatigue Frost, to the point where I'm very sad that I'm putting it in like the meme category. But this deck is actually a lot stronger than people want to give it credit. But unfortunately, there's just a lot of aggressive decks right now. It's just really hard for this deck to survive, even though you do have Soul Freeze. And that's very sad to say, because this deck really does come down to the Popgar pop-off. And there's a reason why Popgar is finding its way in almost every single aggressive Warlock archetype right now, because the payoff of Popgar into Crescendo is just absolutely mind-boggling at times, to where Fatigue Warlock decks are actually making a real comeback. And I gotta say, I didn't believe in these cards when they arrived in Festival of Legend, and I find it very amazing that these cards are actually playable now, even though it just took a little bit of extra support. So whenever you see an unplayable card in Hearthstone, you never know what they're planning. There might be something going on with Chaos Creation and Mage in the next couple expansions. We just have to sit tight and see what card designs they're thinking of right now. But Fatigue Warlock is a great way of being able to play a combo Warlock that can sometimes beat Warrior, sometimes beat Druid. But in order to beat Druid, we kind of have to go with a double Shallow Grave combo. So watch out for what your frackings hit. Watch out for how much tempo and how much fatigue you end up taking. This is a very powerful deck in the right hands, but sometimes your matchups will put you in very awkward positions to where you have to really understand how to survive and how to stall the best in order to make this deck sing. Because there are some situations where you can clutch out a game by turn 8, but there are other situations where you have to wait by turn 10 in order to even have a chance of popping off enough damage to kill your opponent with the fatigue. But I'm putting this in the meme category because I don't think I can confidently put this as one of the best decks in the game. But I want to keep showcasing this deck because I feel like no one is playing Fatigue Warlock except for people that check out Clark HELLSCREAM. So play this deck on ladder if you want to have some fun and if you want to try and show that Sludge Warlock is not the only good Warlock deck in town, because Fatigue Combo Warlock has a lot of game, but unfortunately it's just not in the right metagame for this deck to be in tier 1. I'm going to be honest with you guys. Druid is absolutely bonkers, to the point where people are actually playing Death Beetle and winning with it. World Champion Pocket Train was playing this deck today on his stream, and he ended with a 55% win rate after about 40 games. And it's not because Death Beetle is good. It's not because a Nubricon into Elder Nadox is actually a good combo. It's just how good Druid is as an archetype. However, there's one thing to point out, that Audio Amplifier does make Death Beetle into Shadow Reflections into an actual combo, to where for 11 mana, you can deal 20 damage. So that's actually pretty cool. But on top of that, if you somehow have a board that you have stuck, you could do a very easy combo with a Nubricon into Elder Nadox with double Beetle, and then you might even be able to play a Shadow Reflections on there. I don't know the full potential of this deck because I'm very scared of playing it. I'll be honest, I'm very scared of making this deck actually sing on ladder, because I don't tend to have good luck with these kind of archetypes on the ladder. I'm just not a lucky gamer. But regardless, oh my lord, Elder Nadox has been getting way more love than it has ever gotten since this card came out almost 2 years ago. And I guess, you know, better late than never, because this card is on its way out in the next couple of months. So if you have an Elder Nadox that you've been sitting on, this is the time to use it, because this card is going to be rotating in about a month or two. So yeah, Undead Druid finds a way with Death Beetle because of how good ANR into Shadow Reflections and ramping actually is. So if you want to play the most fun deck that you could play right now, this is probably one of them, because I can't imagine we're going to have another meta where Death Beetle is going to be an actual meta-relevant card. And speaking of Elder Nadox, this is another deck that showcases how this combo can actually work out. And honestly, I'm just going to show you guys a clip of this deck in action instead of me actually explaining this deck to you, because I believe that once you see this deck in action, everything is just going to make sense. So a lot of you guys are probably going to be asking, who made this deck? It was Fino.
Oh my god, I did it!
I swear, dude,
Dude, I did it!
his attitude is so infectious. I love it. Pino definitely comes up with some of the best content in Hearthstone. I'm just going to give him a little shout out here. But yep, everything gains 7. And then, we're not done yet. Everything gains an additional 12. That is 87 damage. I'm sorry for the video quality, but that is 87 damage. We're gonna let him pop off. We're gonna let him pop off, King.
I was worried. I'm never cutting it. I'm never cutting it.
And before you guys ask, yes, this will be in the next highlight video. But yeah, if that doesn't sell you on this deck, I really don't know what will, because I will say this right now. I have not popped off that combo yet, and I have played about 3 or 4 games with this deck, and then I just immediately gave up because I knew that it wasn't going to happen. At least Fino did it, so we have the clip. You guys know the potential of this deck. But yeah, I would highly recommend playing this deck if you just want to play with your friends. This is not a deck I would recommend climbing on ladder unless you just want to go for the glory of the combo. But yeah, if you want to play an interesting take on Druid that isn't just abusing due process every single game, even though this deck can definitely do that, then you might have fun with Elder Nadox, a Nubercon Druid. If you guys have been watching my streams, you will know that one of my favorite new archetypes of the expansion is actually an Excavate deck. Even though Shroomskavate is a card that I have a lot of mixed feelings on, I do love the idea of the Azure Knight Murloc, and it's very weird for me to be saying that this is one of my favorite decks on the mini set, because I historically have never enjoyed Evolved Shaman, and there's a reason for it. I don't like how innately random it all is, because it's all about who can get the best evolves, and when Evolved Shaman is on top of the meta, it's literally just RNG simulator. It's just a coin flip simulator, and I'm not about that. But for some reason, there's something about this deck that just speaks to me. And maybe it's because I originally thought of the idea of what happens if we play double Clownfish in order to make the Excavate reward cost 0. I'm not the first person to think of it. Maybe you saying originally was incorrect. But regardless, as soon as I saw the reward, I immediately thought, oh, double Clownfish. So what if we make this into a Murloc deck that can use these high cost cards and then evolve them into even better minions. So Gorlock Ravager suddenly turning into an 8-drop for 5 mana seems really cool to me. But then you also have Reno in this deck, and the reason that Reno is in here is because if you happen to get the Excavate Treasure and then you play it, hopefully all of your minions will evolve into no duplicates, so that way Reno will actually become active, and that is just omega big brain to me. And it's kind of insane like how much game this deck actually has. The more that I play it, the more that it impresses me with its play pattern, but unfortunately there is a Druid meta that we are dealing with, and I can't say that it's very easy to get the Excavate reward as quickly as possible like some other classes, because with the Shaman cards in particular, they cost 3 mana. There's the other Excavate card that doesn't even find its way into this list because it is just 4 mana and way too clunky. So, and the big reason why these cards cost so much is because you have cards like Conductivity. And this card isn't going away when we have a rotation. So Conductivity with a bunch of Excavate cards could still be the way to go in the future if Shaman actually has a reason of being able to actually utilize this. Sir Finley the Intrepid, an amazing card in order to give yourself some comeback, and you can remove everything with a Jam Session. So for 5 mana, you can completely wipe out the board and then build up your own sort of combo. And then who knows, maybe there's even a way of playing like Finley into Jam Session into Shroomskavate in the same turn in order to not only remove your opponent's board, but also have a way of dealing a lot of damage. Like, this deck just has a lot of surprising game that you would not originally think, to the point where Cactus Cutters sells me on the Murloc package because this card draws your Excavate cards. It draws your Shroomskavate. It can draw Trusty Companion, which can make this card into a 3/4 and then suddenly into a 5/8 or a 5/7 for 2 mana. So that seems like a really good amount of value to me. And I think that Excavate Shaman has a lot of potential going for it. But unless something happens to the metagame, this deck is just not going to have enough breathing room. And it makes me very sad because I had a very spicy idea with this card and Melomania in order to get a bunch of random cards and then evolve them. But unfortunately, that is a bit of a pipe dream. But if you want to have some fun playing the new cards, I believe this is probably going to be the most consistent Excavate Shaman that you can play on ladder right now. But unfortunately, it's just not going to win a lot of games because this deck does get overrun by the amount of armor and the amount of aggression that you're going to see with like Sludge Warlock. And the last deck that I want to showcase is going to be a video that I will be showing here very soon, but I actually had a turn 5 lethal with this deck with Rainbow DK. Dust Assassin for culture, because you play Rainbow DK for the culture more than anything else. So what exactly is going on with this insane deck? It is essentially an aggressive version of Rainbow Death Knight that is aiming to utilize the Corpse Bride Stitch Giant combo to where I actually was able to get 10 corpses by turn 10 with both giants in my hand, to where I played a 5 mana Corpse Bride into a 10/10 minion with taunt into double 8/8s, and my opponent literally just conceded the next turn, because what are you going to do against all of those stats? It was really funny to do, and the main reason why we were able to even do this was because of mining casualties. I don't exactly remember how the game went, but it was mining casualties in the crop rotation with a bit of my 1-drops that got killed in the early game, and that's why I got 10 corpses, because mining casualties is 2 mana essentially gain 4 corpses. So now running Corpse Bride might actually have some real game now, because of this consistent early game that you can very easily get as many corpses as you can generate by turn 5. So 10 corpses are not that hard to get. The rest of the deck is playing cards like Murloculus, so that way you can utilize, again, the mining casualties to play this card as soon as you can. You have Malignant Horror, which can definitely benefit from having those 4 corpses. Like, you see what I mean about mining casualties? It is like the perfect card in Death Knight, not because it's a powerful card by itself, but because of how it enables everything else in the deck. I've been saying for the longest time that the issue with Rainbow Death Knight is not the card quality, it's the fact that we don't have a lot of ways of generating corpses as well as ways of spending corpses. But we finally got one of those cards that actually generates corpses very well. In addition to crop rotation, and in all fairness, this is an amazing card for corpses, but mining casualties on top of crop rotation is just so many corpses to where we can finally enable these cards that need a decent amount of corpses to actually be good. Unfortunately, I'm not sure how good Ma and Pa is. I would actually maybe suggest replacing this card with Hell Yeah, so that way you can beat up on Druids. I just don't believe in this card overall. But the new Miniset card, the Crusher, the Quartzite Crusher, is actually an amazingly good card, because it's just a 4 mana deal 9 damage if you can connect a lot to the face. This would be really good if we weren't in an armor druid meta where we're dealing with like 50 HP all the freaking time. But this deck actually has a lot of surprising amounts of gas, even though you may not consider it, like Primus, Climactic Necrotic Explosion, and Rezka as ways of being able to initiate late game strategies, so we're not just getting blown out if our early game strategy isn't good enough. I'm not 100% sure on the sickly Grimewalker. Maybe there's a way of making this deck a little bit more aggressive with more damage and more ways of pressuring onto the board, but I unfortunately just don't have enough games with this deck in order to really recommend too many other ideas. I did go 2 and 3 in top 100 Legend with this deck, so do with that information what you will. It can win games, it just will not consistently win games. But one other card I want to talk about before we end this video is Acolyte of Death, because this card works really well, not only with crop rotation, but specifically with mining casualties. So that way, if you play this card again on turn 2, this card's insane, and then you have your turn 3, you trade the recruits away, you play your Acolyte of Death, and then you trade those 1/1s away, and then you get 2 card draw. So this deck actually has almost every single piece that it has been missing enabled, all because of mining casualties. Do not sleep on this card in your Death Knight decks, because you definitely want this for the corpse spending. But regardless, if you want a fun way of being able to grind the ladder with a payoff for a Rainbow DK, then this might be the best way of actually going about it, to where you can win in an aggressive strategy, and it's not just about building up a gigantic 10 mana spell that you may never play. But regardless, I had to showcase this deck because Rainbow DK is the best archetype in Hearthstone, and I don't care what any of you guys say about it. But those are going to be the most powerful, most fun decks that I believe that you can have fun with in Hearthstone. So if you like these deck ideas, go ahead, like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, yada, yada, yada. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video, to where I'm just going to plug the Patreon real quick. A huge shout out to our patrons over at patreon.com/ClarkHellScream that get extra perks and bonuses like deck optimizations, coaching, as well as shout outs in future videos. So if you want any of those extra perks and bonuses, go ahead and check out the Patreon in order to help support this content, so that way we can keep making videos for the rest of 2024. But guys, thank you so much for making it to the end of this top 5s video, and we'll see you for the next one.